Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about some lesser known books from classic authors. So in January last month, I read two books from two of my favorite classic authors, but they were lesser known books from those authors, and I fell in love with them, and I want to recommend them to you. I also want to recommend you a few other lesser known books from classic authors that you may have heard of, but you may not hear too much about these other books that were written by them. This is something that I want to implement a lot more in my reading. I feel like there are certain books that just don't get highlighted as much. So these are books that I haven't heard too much about. If you have heard about them, I'm so glad. But if you haven't heard about them, then I hope that I inspire you to maybe look into reading them. So I have some recommendations. I have 5 recommendations, and I also have 5 books that are on my TBR. So I thought that this would be fun. I would love to know what books that you think are either underrated, that you wish more people were reading or were talking about, and I would love to know maybe some books that are on your TBR that fit into this category as well. So I also want to briefly mention, before we get into my recommendations in TBR, I want to highlight a publisher that really honors this type of book, and that is Persephone Books. You could see the bookmark. They come with bookmarks as well. So Persephone Books is a publisher based in Bath in England, and I actually got the pleasure to go at the end of last year to the original bookshop in Bath of Persephone, and I picked up this book. And so this is a great example of a book that is from an author that is well known, but this book in particular, this one of theirs, isn't as widely read. And so this is The Making of a Marchioness by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So Frances Hodgson Burnett, if you don't know, she wrote The Secret Garden, which is one of my favorite classics. It is a book that has been beloved for many years, and there are many different movie adaptations of it. So The Secret Garden is widely loved, but I don't hear a ton of people talking about this one. So Persephone Books mainly publishes books that are out of print primarily by women, and I believe from around the 20th century. And they want to honor and print these books that aren't widely printed and widely read, and they just want to honor those writers that have kind of gone out of print and bring them back and give them a new life. So Persephone is really just the publisher that highlights this entire concept of shining a light on these hidden gems. So this is on my TBR. I haven't read it yet. I'm really excited to, because like I said, I love The Secret Garden, and I want to read more from the writers that I really enjoy other more well-known works from. So this is a great example. And then the rest of the books on here I don't have copies of right now because I'm in England. A lot of my copies of these books are in New York. So my first two recommendations are the 2 books that inspired this video. And the first one I read in January, and it's tied, I feel like, for first place for my favorite book of the year so far. If you don't know, I've been talking about it in my recent videos. I have been reading incredible books so far in 2025, and this is one of them, and that is The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery. Oh my goodness gracious, I don't even know how to begin talking about this book. So Ella Montgomery is known for her Anne of Green Gables series. I first read the Anne of Green Gables series, I think in 2018 or 2019, and I fell in love with them, and Anne has such a special place in my heart. But Ella Montgomery has written so many stories, so many books, and one of them is The Blue Castle, and not a lot of people talk about it. I recently mentioned it in my videos in January, and I saw a lot of comments about people saying that they also love The Blue Castle, and that made me so happy. But if you haven't heard of The Blue Castle and you want to maybe experience more of Ella Montgomery's writing, I can't recommend you read The Blue Castle enough. If you love characters like Charlotte Lucas and Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, you will love The Blue Castle, and you will love its main character, Valancy Sterling. It's basically about this main character who is a bit older, so Ella Montgomery writes a lot about younger characters, but Valancy Sterling is 29, and she's one of the only older characters in Ella Montgomery's stories. And basically, Valency has never had a boyfriend, she's never had a romantic relationship, and she doesn't have a ton of friends. She's quite isolated because her family is very stifling, and she hasn't really been able to live her life the way she wants to. And one day, something happens, and it completely changes things for her, and she starts going her own way. And it is the most validating, hilarious story I have ever read. I was genuinely laughing out loud so much throughout the whole book, and it has become an all-time favorite, so cannot recommend it enough. Another one by Ella Montgomery that I have read and I want to continue reading because it's a series, it is the Emily of New Moon series. I read the first book, Emily of New Moon, and I need to read the next two. I believe it's Emily Climbs and Emily's Quest. It's more similar to Anne of Green Gables. We're following a younger orphan type character. I read it quite a few years ago and I don't remember a ton about Emily of New Moon. So I might have to do a reread and then read the whole series, but that is another recommendation and another one that's on my TBR. So Ella Montgomery is, I knew she was already a favorite author of mine because I love the Anne of Green Gables series so much, but I love when you're able to read other works from a writer and really establish them as a favorite author, and so that's what I really love about doing this concept of lesser known books from those favorite authors. The next one that I also read in January was Night Flight by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He is the writer of The Little Prince, and The Little Prince is one of the greatest classics. It's one of my all-time favorite books absolutely ever, like top 3. I wanted to read more from him, and I knew he had these other novels centering, or novellas centering around flying because he was an aviator, and he was born in France. He's a wonderful French writer. The Little Prince actually is, I think, the second most translated book after the Bible, which I always find so fascinating. So if you love The Little Prince, I highly recommend checking out his other works. So the one that I read, like I said, is Night Flight. We are following night pilots that are flying night mail from Patagonia, Chile, and Paraguay to Argentina. It's a wonderful story about the pilots, the very brave pilots that fly this night mail, and the crew members. And it's just a really fascinating insight into aviation at the time. And it was so fascinating because I knew and could sense that what Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was writing about was from his own, it was influenced by his own experiences. So when he describes the feeling of flying at night, you can just sense that he's writing it from his own experiences, and I just loved that so much, so highly recommend. Other ones from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry that are on my TBR are Wind, Sand, and Stars and Flight to Arras. Those are two more novellas, I believe, that are centering around aviation, and I think that that's really interesting, and I just want to read more from him. Also, the writing in Night Flight, you can so sense his writing style that I'm so familiar with from The Little Prince. You can really feel it, his poetic language and just the beauty that he has in his writing. You can really sense that in his other works as well. So I'm excited to recommend you Night Flight, and I'm excited to read Wind, Sand, and Stars and Flight to Arras in the future. The next one I have, it's one of my favorite authors, and he's known for his children's literature. So the author is E.B. White. He is known for Charlotte's Web and The Trumpet of the Swan and Stuart Little. I have a collection of his essays and I have been reading through them. I also found another essay collection that is newer to me. I don't know exactly when it came out, but it is from McNally Jackson, which is a bookstore, an independent bookshop in New York. It's based in New York. They have a few locations in New York, and I went to, I believe it's on Prince Street. Leon and I went last summer and we loved it, and they have their own press and they release different editions of books, and one of them was a collection of E.B. White's short essays, and I found it in Waterstones this past week, and I was reading through it, and I just loved it. So I wanted to highlight E.B. White because I feel like I don't hear a ton of people talking about him. He was not only a writer of children's literature, but he was also a fantastic journalist. I believe he worked for The New Yorker for many, many years. He was primarily a journalist, and I believe later in his life he wrote more stories for children, and I just really want to highlight his other shorter works. Yeah, I really love his writing and highly recommend checking out more of his work if you haven't. The next novel I want to, or nonfiction novel, I want to recommend is Aspects of the Novel by E.M. Forster. This is a book that I talk about quite a lot, but I don't hear a ton of people talking about, so I want to highlight it here. It's a nonfiction book about, as you could guess from the title, aspects of novels. And E.M. Forster is known for A Room with a View and Howard's End and A Passage to India. Like I said, I don't hear a ton of people talking about this nonfiction work. So he did these lectures at, I believe, Cambridge University. And this book is a collection of those lectures that he gave at Cambridge. And I feel so lucky to be able to read these lectures because obviously I wasn't able to go to the lectures. He talks about writing and reading novels in such a beautiful way. You can tell and sense his love, his genuine love of literature, his genuine love of stories, and it really gave me such an interesting insight into novels in general as a writer and a reader myself. And I loved it. So if you're interested in writing and even just looking at novels as a reader or a writer, I really think that there is so much to take away from this nonfiction work of his and these lectures that he gave. E.M. Forster is, again, just a writer that I adore so much, and the other book that I want to read from him that's on my TBR is The Longest Journey. I read an article years ago, and I believe I'm correct in thinking this, that in that article he said his favorite of his own works is The Longest Journey. And I believe it's the one that is least talked about, which I find really interesting, and it makes me want to read the book even more, knowing that it's his favorite of his own works, but also one that not a lot of people read. I want to see how I feel about it. So that's another one on my TBR and another one I recommend. The last recommendation I have for you is Flush by Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is so beloved and so well known, especially for A Room of One's Own and To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway, and those are all books that I have read and loved and highly recommend. But Flush, I have seen around a little bit, but not as much as her other novels, and I want to recommend it here. So I was actually gifted Flush by, I believe, 2 subscribers. They sent it to me, which is amazing, because I have a dog named Willow, and she is half Cavalier and half Cocker Spaniel, and Flush is a biography about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cocker Spaniel, which is named and called Flush, is the dog's name. And it's this wonderful fictionalized biography about this Cocker Spaniel, and it's such a unique story. It's so wonderful. It's quite short. If you want to get into Virginia Woolf, I feel like this might be a great introduction because I found it quite easy to just naturally dip into. Virginia Woolf's writing, because she writes a lot in stream of consciousness, it just can take a little time to get used to and get into the flow of her writing style, but I feel like Flush is a really just great one to dip right into. So that is my recommendation. I have 2 more that are on my TBR that don't go with a recommendation. So the first one is from Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is known for Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Far From the Madding Crowd, and he is a well-beloved author for very good reason. I love Tess and Far From the Madding Crowd. But the one that I want to read that's on my TBR, well, really 2, but the main one that I don't hear a ton about is A Pair of Blue Eyes. And the other one is Jude the Obscure. Jude the Obscure I do hear a good amount about, but I don't hear a ton about A Pair of Blue Eyes. Thomas Hardy, his writing is so vivid and heartbreaking and just absolutely gorgeous. He writes a lot of really, really heartbreaking and heartrending stories, but they have so much hope and light in them as well. I know Jude the Obscure is I believe, really, really heartbreaking. A Pair of Blue Eyes, I don't really know what it's about. I don't know if I want to know too much of what it's about, and I don't know if it's heartbreaking, so we will have to just read it and find out. But yes, I love Thomas Hardy, and I want to read more of his lesser-known works as well. And then the last one is from another one of my all-time favorite writers, and that is Ernest Hemingway. My favorite books from Ernest Hemingway are A Farewell to Arms and A Movable Feast, but I also love The Old Man and the Sea and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and I just love everything that Hemingway has written. The one that I have on my shelves at home that I haven't read yet that I really want to, and I hear no one talking about, is The Garden of Eden. This book, I think, was his second novel that was published posthumously, and to be honest, I don't know what it's about. And I don't have too many Ernest Hemingway books that I have yet to read, so I really don't want to know what this one is about. I just want to go in and be pleasantly surprised. But I love Hemingway's writing. He is such an honest, succinct writer, but he captures so much poetry in his lack of poetic language, if that makes sense. I feel like his writing is so elegant and beautiful, but also kind of harsh and to the point, and I love it. So yes, that is a Hemingway that is on my TBR, and I just recommend everything that he's written because, like I said, he's one of my favorite authors. So those are all the books that I wanted to talk about, recommend, tell you that the ones that are on my TBR. I hope that you find this video interesting. Maybe you get some good recommendations or books to add to your TBR. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I would love to know if there are any books from well-known authors that you think deserve to be talked about more and to be read by more people, or just underrated classics in general. I would really love to know because I want to add more to my TBR. I think the thing that The Blue Castle and Night Flight has taught me is I really want to read more underrated classics, not only from my favorite authors, but also from authors that I haven't read from before. So I would love your recommendations, and like I said, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful and interesting. So I will see you very soon in another video. I hope you're doing extremely well, and as always, happy reading!